If you want to understand real food security, you have to step back to a time when, honestly, failure meant hunger, not just inconvenience. During World War II, governments did not trust supply chains, global trade, or centralized agriculture to keep civilians alive. They trusted seeds, not packets bought each spring, but, living genetics meant to outlast disruption. Seed pods collected, dried, stored, traded, and replanted year after year became an unspoken insurance policy. When transport routes collapsed and fertilizers were rationed, those pods ensured that food production never truly stopped. What makes this topic matter today is that the same principles that worked under bombardment still work now. Yet, most people have forgotten them. How wartime pressure forced nations to treat seeds as strategic assets. By the early 1940s, Allied governments understood that modern agriculture was fragile. Large farms relied on fuel, chemicals, and predictable weather. War removed all three. Britain, the United States, and parts of occupied Europe quietly pushed citizens towards seed saving, emphasizing open-pollinated crops that reproduced true year after year. These seeds were not hybrid experiments. They were stable, resilient varieties selected for dependable yield, storage ability, and adaptability. Farmers and home gardeners alike were instructed to let certain plants mature fully, harvesting the seed pods instead of the vegetables. This was not about gardening hobbies, it was about ensuring next season's calories regardless of what the war destroyed. Why seed pods mattered more than stored food. Canned goods and grain stockpiles helped in the short term, but wartime planners knew stored food eventually runs out. Seed pods, by contrast, regenerate abundance. A single pod from beans, peas or brassicas could produce dozens of plants the following year, each one generating more pods in turn. This multiplication effect made seeds, honestly, exponentially more valuable than preserved food. A sack of wheat feeds a family for months. A sack of viable seed feeds generations. That distinction shaped wartime thinking and explains why seed libraries quietly appeared in agricultural offices, monasteries, and even private homes across Europe. After the war, things changed quite a bit. Modern agriculture moved away from the wartime seed model, and, speed and profit became the main priorities instead of resilience. Hybrid seeds came onto the scene, promising higher short-term yields, but they broke that old chain of self-sufficiency. Suddenly, farmers found themselves needing to buy new seeds every year. Governments, too, started pushing for uniform crops that would fit neatly with mechanization and chemical inputs. Those old seed pods, ones you could save and use year after year, just weren't encouraged anymore, since, honestly, they didn't fit the new business model. What was lost, you see, wasn't just a bit of tradition. It was an entire system that let communities stay independent, especially when larger systems failed. The disappearance of those WWII-era seed practices, it wasn't some accident. No, it happened because economic incentives started to outweigh the value of long-term security. The way folks saved and shared seed pods during the war, that's what really gave crops their genetic resilience. Wartime gardeners, they did something that, modern agriculture rarely even attempts. They picked seeds from the plants that managed to survive their own local conditions. If you lived in a dry region, you'd save seeds from drought-tolerant plants. Up north, you'd go for the cold, hardy ones. And where there weren't any chemicals around, you'd pick the pest-resistant plants. Over time, these seed lines didn't just survive. They became hyper-adapted to their own environments. You know, this local adaptation is really the reason why so many seeds from the World War II era still manage to outperform modern varieties, especially in poor soil and unpredictable weather. They were bred by necessity, not by marketing departments, and that made all the difference. The process itself is, well, pretty straightforward, but it does require a bit of discipline. Instead of harvesting every edible plant, you actually set aside the strongest specimens and let those go to seed. For example, beans are left on the vine until the pods dry out and rattle. Lettuce is allowed to bolt and flower, eventually producing those fluffy seed heads that you collect and dry. And squash, well, you leave that until it's fully mature, then just wash, dry and store the seeds. The key step here is labelling and rotating, really. Back in the day, World War II gardeners would write dates, locations, and even growing conditions right on the envelopes. This simple habit allowed them to track which seeds perform best over time. And honestly, anyone with a small garden, or even just a few containers, can replicate this system in a single season. Now, you see, there's a reason why seed pods tend to outperform modern seed packets, especially when things go sideways. Commercial seeds, well, they're bred for ideal conditions. Perfect soil, reliable water, all the right fertilizers. But wartime seeds, those were made for survival. They germinate reliably, even if you forget about them for a bit, and they bounce back from stress. When fertilizer is scarce or watering is hit and miss, those traits matter a whole lot more than having every plant look exactly the same. Back during the war, families grew food wherever they could. Bombed out lots, heavy clay, even rubble-strewn ground. The seed pod varieties that managed to thrive in those tough spots were carefully saved and shared. That bit of history, honestly, is why these genetics still do so well in today's poor soils. Seed pods aren't just about getting a good harvest one season, they're about generational security. The real lesson from the war isn't about squeezing the highest yield out of every acre. It's about keeping food on the table, year after year. Seed pods, in their quiet way, let knowledge and nourishment pass from one generation to the next. Unlike food that sits on a shelf and goes off, seeds don't really expire if you keep them going. When families saved seeds during the war, they weren't just thinking about themselves. They were making sure their children and their grandchildren would have something to eat, even if things got worse. That sort of thinking, well, it's rare these days, but it's just as important as ever. There's a reason to remember all this, especially now. Supply chains might be efficient, but they're fragile. Weather is all over the place, costs keep creeping up. The old wartime seed pod practices, they offer something modern systems simply can't. Independence, and you don't need fancy technology. What you do need is patience, a good eye, and a bit of respect for living things. That's why these seeds survived war, scarcity, and all sorts of upheaval. They were never about being fashionable. They were built to last. So if you reckon this kind of forgotten wartime wisdom matters, and if you think history still has answers that modern systems tend to miss, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone who values resilience over convenience. These lessons were paid for dearly, and honestly, they deserve to be remembered.